Welcome everyone to the next show of CFO Inside TV. I'm very happy that you joined again, and I'm happy to welcome you to our second talk in our series with Professor Harold James from Princeton University. Professor James, welcome once again for our second session. Last week we spoke about financial markets and especially the Eurozone. This time we want to talk about a little bit more about globalization in a broader perspective. So thanks for joining us for the second talk.
It is wonderful to be with you again.
What I would like to start with is coming back to an earlier book of yours, The Creation and Destruction of Value. In there you mentioned that globalization is going in circles or in cycles, actually, and that is extremely unstable as a process. From a day-to-day perspective, we always think globalization is marching ahead. So can you define what you mean by its instability and its cyclicality?
I was just struck by how old globalization was as a phenomenon. So it wasn't just a question of the 19th century being very globalized or the early 20th century, the era before the First World War, being very globalized. But, for instance, we know that the Roman Empire had a substantial amount of commerce with Asian markets, and that we find now skeletons of Asian people in southern Italy and skeletons of Romans on the Chinese coast.
But would that not mean that globalization is a constant process of progress? Is it cyclicality implies that we have drawbacks as well?
Absolutely. I mean, there are then these big periods of setbacks. I think the fall of the Roman Empire is one of those setbacks. The 30 Years' War in the 17th century is one of those setbacks. The period of the Napoleonic Wars was a setback for the globalization of the 18th century. And the First World War was a setback to the era that I think most people are most familiar with as the first classic era of modern-style globalization.
Does a setback automatically mean destruction of value?
Yes, the setback is the period in which every kind of connection is broken and things that used to be valuable now have no value at all. So it's a real reassessment of things, and actually it works as well in terms of immaterial values as well as material values.
You mean in terms of knowledge or
in terms of
culture?
The increase of barbarism in the periods of breakdown of globalization. That's the way that we usually think of the globalization breakdowns. That they're barbarian episodes.
Okay.
The end of the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Or the terror of the French Revolution, or the First World War.
You also say globalization is inherently prone for financial crises. Why is that?
People, when they're confident about global interconnectedness, put their money over long distances. So capital tends to flow very, very easily and very freely in the globalization periods. When there's a reaction against it, then those debt contracts get challenged. People will say, we don't want to repay you, we can't repay you. And those things lose value as well.
Would you say the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 and the period we're going through at the moment is a setback in globalization, or is it just a financial crisis?
I think you notice it very much in European discussions, that there's a great deal of renationalization of the discussion in Europe, that there's an issue of North versus South. There's an issue of Southern Europeans saying German interests are inflicting things on us. There's a question of Germans thinking they're paying for Southern Europeans. Everything is recast in national terms. And that seems to me to be actually an indication of the incipient anti-globalization backlash.
Is that a European phenomenon, or is that on a world scale? Because we see China very strongly moving into the global economy. So there is also a push towards globalization from the Asian area. So what's the balance there?
You're right, it's a balance, but I think you even see in the Chinese discussion some kind of uncertainty about the global future, in the sense that in the pure globalization phase, we rely on markets to do things. We rely on markets to provide us with oil, markets to provide us with fuel, with energy, with water, with food. And when you're beginning to be skeptical about globalization. You think, no, we need to have power we need to have political control in order to get the things that we need. And so in these phases, you get the idea you can't always depend on the markets. So China needs instead to own assets overseas.
Do you think to resolve that, we will see a global governance system evolving in the future, or what will be the next steps going forward in terms of globalization?
One of the characteristics of the current crisis was that in its early phases, it was characterized by a unique degree of intense international cooperation. I think it reached its height
central banks working together.
Central banks working together, with governments working together, with the G20 process working very well. That reached a height in London but in April 2009. But since then, there's been a retreat. And I believe that global governance is much less effective now than it was in 2009. That is actually also one of the incipient signs of this backlash against the globalization push.
Well, let's hope maybe it's not getting as bad, because after all, when you say globalization is a source of creating value, let's hope we will find back on a path towards more globalization. To close the second session, again, 3 very short questions. First of all, despite all cycles and setbacks, do you think globalization will continue to deepen in the course of this century?
I think in the immediate period, we're in for a rather rough ride. After that, it may resume. But the immediate future is certainly uncertain.
What about China? Will it continue to move more into the global economy, or will it, as in historic times, close itself off again at one point, let's say over the next 50 years?
China faces a unique demographic crisis that is going to be more severe than the demographic crisis that faces Japan or Europe at the moment. And in that sense, that makes for a very explosive setting.
And the final question, do you think Britain will leave the European Union, and will it be to their benefit or not?
I hope that the UK won't leave the European Union, but it does seem to me that the same forces that push against globalization also are pushing against European integration, and so the incentives to retreat into your shell become greater in this kind of era.
Thank you very much, Professor Harold James. I'm glad that you came over from Princeton for our little talks here. And thank you very much, everyone, for joining us for the second series of our talk with Professor Harold James. I hope you enjoyed watching us, and I look forward to seeing you again next week for our next show of CFO Inside TV.